Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Look at that. Here we go. We're back at it again. It is Thursday, June the 12th, as we record this just ahead of 8 o'clock. So things may have changed by the time you heard this. You know the warnings. Dave Trafford here. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Welcome in. There is a good deal to talk about this week, but and we probably won't get to everything that's on our list. So it's just one of those mornings. So let's get to it now. Around the table, John Wright is here. He is our veteran pollster and founding pollster here at On the Ledge. Keith Leslie is here, a longtime observer at Queen's Park, and you know him from CHTV in Hamilton. Kathleen Wynne, you'll know her as the former Premier of Ontario. And here is Tim Hudak, and he is, of course, a former leader of the PC Party in Ontario and a partner now at Council Public Affairs. I just wanted to, again, let you know I've got the uniform on today. These are all Fender guitars, just in case you were just wondering. They're all.
Is that like the best? Is that the sort of Rolls Royce of guitars? I'm sorry for ignorance.
Well, you have an argument with the Les Paul people.
There's a debate.
Yeah, for sure.
And with the bass.
Les Paul is the guy who actually was, among other things, he was viewed as the creator of the electric guitar. One.
Really?
Second thing is, he is the guy who's responsible for all of the cool effects that you hear, whether it's effects on keyboards or on guitars, the pedal effects and so on.
Yeah.
His wife's name was Mary Ford, and she was an accomplished guitar player as well. And the two of them, one of the songs they had in the day was How High the Moon. And so there's I'll send you the link, Tim. There's a really cool album, a tribute to Les Paul. And there's all these epic players who are playing on this record. And Les Paul plays with every one of them. And he was in his 80s at the time.
Wow.
So it's between Les Paul and Leo Fender.
Okay.
And Fender's the other guy. And of course, and John, you'll know you've got a Fender or two in your life.
The bass category seems to be much more representative with the Fender family. Rickenbacker every once in a while sticks its head in, but Fender's there all the time.
Yeah.
I'm glad I asked. I know nothing. I could recognize a guitar, right? in a lineup of instruments. Probably I could pick it up by ear, but I've got no idea one guitar from the other.
So I got a text message from a buddy, and last week I sent you guys the video of us jamming out at the Galway pub, and one of the fellas that was there, as I said, we played together for like 50 years. So on Saturday morning, he sends me a text message with a photograph. He says, "I've got gas." That's guitar acquisition syndrome.
I know that.
Well, yeah. One of these days, I'll give you the camera tour of the other room here. There are about 25 of the. I probably got more on in the studio than I have on my shirt.
I think if you're in that kind of a band, you have obsessive compulsive disorder. You never have just one.
That's right. That's all good. So yes, I'm wearing the outfit, and I was looking for my Downchild hat because just kind of goes with it. But I'll stick with my Ontario Highway 1 hat as we move forward. Plenty to get to, and we will talk about what's going on with G7. Interesting to see. I think shortly after we signed off last week, John, the Prime Minister actually did table the legislation talking about one economy, so we'll get into that. The whole idea, do we have a deal? Is there no deal? Is it all going to happen during Kananaskis or around that time? We'll get to that. But one of the things that popped into my feed this week was a story from Anwar Knight on my Facebook page. And those of you who are consumers of media in Toronto probably have come across Anwar over the years when he was working at CTV. I worked with his wife Laura at Global, so it's a media family. And I sent the Facebook posting to you guys just to review. I'm going to include the link in the show notes for this show because it's a rather lengthy dissertation from Anwar explaining the situation. And I don't want to really do too much of an effort and try to paraphrase exactly what's in there. So I would encourage you to go and have a listen to what he has to say. The bottom line is his son was at school 18 months ago, was assaulted at school, 2 broken bones, had to go to Sick Kids Hospital. It was a serious situation. The family, that is Anwar and his family, are saying that up until now, the school board, the appeal board, has done nothing but obfuscate and get in the way of having a real clear indication of what happened and any level of accountability in terms of where there was any level of investigation, who did what to whom. And it got to a point where the family required a court order to get information from the school board. The police got involved. Eventually, there were charges laid. The individual involved who was alleged to have committed the assault was moved to another school. But I think what's even more concerning is the number of school board officials and school officials who are on something of a carousel, moving in and out of it. And based on his telling of it, and admittedly, this is Anwar's telling of it, because we don't have anything from the school board, etc. But given the nature of the story itself, that's the problem. Their whole question of transparency, accountability, protocol, following the questions and issues around school safety. Kathleen, I realized, buying statues in Italy is a problem, but this to me is speaking to a much more concerning issue. And based on the feedback that I'm seeing, Anwar and his family aren't alone here. There are other families who are experiencing something just similarly, maybe not as extreme, but similarly, when there are questions of student safety and schools and school boards throw up the privacy issue and make these calls on these situations.
Yeah, so these are very, very difficult situations, Dave. And when I was a school trustee, there were situations where there was real angst on the part of families because of something that had happened at school. And sometimes the issues were handled well by the principal and then the superintendent and board officials, and sometimes they weren't. When I listened to the story that in this video, I don't have enough information to pass judgment on what happened or not. What I do know, though, is that when families don't feel that and when families are not getting the information that they should have, there's going to be a problem. And clearly that's what happened here. Again, I don't think this accusation of this being systemic is necessarily true. I mean, there are issues. There are issues that citizens and populations, residents have with every level of government. Bureaucracy creates challenges, and that's not me being an apologist for the opacity of bureaucracy. It's just a reality. When it's our children who are at risk, there's no excuse for it. And clearly the people who are involved need to be brought to task, taken to task. I don't think that, though, there's any indication that the policies weren't in place. There are policies there. There are expectations there. The safe schools policies that, are in place in every board in the province and were not followed, it sounds like. So that's a problem. That is a huge problem. So, my heart goes out to this family. As I say, I don't have enough information. It's not the whole story. And so I think we need to listen to what is happening. We need to listen. He's started a group that is, calling for more transparency, and there can always be improvement, so maybe there is a need for a change in terms of some of the protocols, but it sounds like the police weren't called when they should have been called, but the rules were there. They weren't followed from what he's saying. And so I think we need to really listen to families who have these situations and And the flip side, we also need to know the story from the other side in terms of what went on with the bureaucracy and to what degree the bureaucracy was dealing with the other family, you know? And we don't have that. We don't have that whole story.
Yeah, it reminds me of the comments I heard from the Auditor General this week, John, vis-a-vis the defense contracts for the F-35. And I know it sounds like I'm making a huge leap here, but her comment was, we don't need more regulation on procurement. There's enough regulation already. People just aren't following the rules. That's the issue here. I don't think we're ever going to really know what happened at the school or the school board, because there is this baked in lack of transparency. There's clearly a culture of it in this case.
Well, I can't speak to the incident nor the culture, but it seems to me that, you're dealing with about, 3 or 4 things. One is the process, which is put up on websites, is available for parents to look at, so that if something happens, the school and everyone needs to know how to proceed. And that's there. There's a process, there are protocols, and this video calls into question all of that. The next thing is the shielding of information by invoking the view of privacy. And that happens a lot in many, many, many different cases nowadays. So, how do you pierce that? In this situation, it took two orders from the court in order to get the information about what was going on. And I think that's troubling as well. But I think the third thing that schools must wrestle with is the punitive nature of what bringing the police in may end up for both the individual and the family. I'm not saying that it's wrong. In fact, with my kids going to school, we experienced some issues, and many other parents around us the same thing. But I think there may be an inherent view of some of the administrators that bringing in that part of the equation is the really heavy hand. And let's say that the police actually came in and got involved at one point. But I think it's difficult on those levels. And the second thing is, if you have a process, the question in my mind, and I don't know the answer, is how often do they have reports like this? Would it be that you are actually dealing with it on a much more constant basis, as opposed to having it, selectively dealt with? So it's clear that this case may not be a notice of a systemic problem, but certainly it really needs to be a review so that there are places in it that protocols are acted upon.
Tim, the thing that popped to mind immediately is, and I have made no, bones about it, I'm a St. Michael's College School alumni. And back in 2018, November, that story just, hit international news about a student being allegedly assaulted in the washroom at the school. They suspended the football team. All of those things happened. And the real crime and I use that advisedly, the real crime in that issue was that Greg Reeves, who was the principal at the time, failed to call the police when he saw the video of what was going on. And to me, it was a no-brainer. Like, why would you not call the police? And similarly, that's what happened here. We didn't call the police. The administration took it into its own hands to kind of come up with it. So it's not like this is, oh my God, something out of the blue has happened. We have seen situations like this elsewhere where there have been serious circumstances, serious outcomes, and boy, the failure of bringing in the police in this case was probably the heart of the matter.
Sure, maybe. I think it's a fair point. I'm actually, the greater concern I had was around the alleged responses by the principal, vice principal, and superintendent, who, Anwar says covered this up, lied. And I don't get that. My dad was a high school principal. Mom was a special needs teacher. And the jobs of significant responsibility. You have to have a lot of character to take on that position and leadership as a principal, vice principal. And I'm very puzzled and disturbed by whatever that motivation may have been. So I don't know if this is just my own curiosity to understand why those decisions were made, or is it broader? Is this an issue that goes across school boards and instances? I will tell you that we had an incident of bullying over our daughter Miller in our local elementary school. She was attacked because of her disability. And we were actually, quite satisfied with the way the principal resolved this. There was transparency, there was appropriate action taken. On the other hand, another couple that we knew had a negative impact in the same situation, where they said their child was bullied, and the parent of the kid that was accused said it was because of racism that her child was being picked on in the school, and it was not satisfied. So I don't know if there was concerns around sensitivity of disability, of race, whatever the motivation. I'd actually like to know, what drove that and how widespread it is.
Well, and here's the problem. And I was talking to my wife about this last night, and she said, well, what, and she raised similar questions in terms of, what was it that was going on behind the scenes? And the issue is, because we do not have the information, Keith, and you will know this as well as anybody, the press gallery does this, or tries to stay away from speculation, but it's hard not to fill the vacuum with the what if, what the hell's going on questions. And that begins to spin out of control in a hurry.
Well, I think I can understand the reluctance on, teachers and principals to be calling in the police every time there's a situation of bullying. We hear violence is on the increase, and, where does the level of violence, where do you draw the line? When do you want to get police involved? Well, when bones are broken, I think it's a pretty clear case of when police should absolutely be called. That's gone beyond bullying now. Someone's been physically assaulted to the point they have to go to the hospital with broken bones. I mean, as you say, we've only heard Anwar's side of this story, but that's more than bullying. That's an out-and-out actual assault, and that needs to be dealt with. And that means the police having schools or school boards investigate these situations when, as I say, when bones have been broken, that's up to a police investigation. I understand the reluctance to bring in the police. If it's just a case of bullying and education and, working with both sides can help deal with that situation. Tim pointed to his situation was dealt with satisfactorily. They're not always going to be, but at least, more efforts have to be made to be more transparent. But to force parents to get a lawyer or to get two lawyers in this particular case that Anwar Knight was talking about, to go to court, to get court orders, to get some very basic information of what actually happened to their son at school, that's beyond the pale. That's just so far beyond the pale. And I think to everyone's point, it's also beyond the rules. I mean, the rules are clearly there, the safe students. So I don't know why this wasn't done, and why, we haven't had the other side of the story. There must be more to it. But what we've seen and heard so far is very disheartening. And I can see why parents will want to organize, but I don't know what more they can do when we have school officials, school board officials, and perhaps even trustees and principals, vice principals, not doing what they're required to do under the law.
So Dave, can I just jump in on this? Because I think the point, what Keith's saying, what Tim said about what happened with Miller, and what you talked about in terms of St. Mike's, like we can tighten rules. We can put more and more protocols in place. But I've been in hundreds of schools around this province. And if we don't ask the right questions and I think the right question in this case is, what's the culture of this school? What's going on here that this information hasn't been made available, that this incident happened in the first place? Where were the people where were the responsible adults at that time? We just don't have all that information. But I think that looking at Anwar Knight and the group of parents he's going to gather, many of whom will be in real pain because of what's happened with their kids. If it's all about more protocols and more rules and more legalistic kind of action, I think we could miss the point. Because the point is often in a school, what's the leadership like? What's the professional development? What's the collegiality? What's the understanding among the teachers about the kind of culture that they want to create? And those cultures differ from school to school, no matter what rules are in place. And that's, I think, where we need to put support in place so that schools are safe environments.
Yeah, but I think also, Tim, that culture is, I think it lands on rightly or wrongly or maybe overstated, but it probably lands in the principal's office. Absolutely. And I'm not laying blame there. I'm just saying it starts there. And anybody I know, teachers, parents, anybody I talk to, they'll talk about the culture of their school and how well it works or how well it doesn't or whatever the case may be. Their impression is a reflection of the character and the quality of the leadership in the principal's office.
I got a ton of respect for principals, and their job is more demanding than ever in our school system. I would like to see our school system give them more authority, and that's why I'm really driven to see what happened here. just it's all gut, right? It's all gut. But at some point, our instincts actually get well honed as we learn more things, and all goes for crap later on. But for the time being, I'm going to go with my gut here. I think there's a larger fear. There must have been some motivation that they were more afraid of than doing the right thing with this kid. So, uncover that. Is that some sort of burden elsewhere? So we're making bizarre decisions because you're afraid to do the right thing. I really do hope that the appeal board itself, or maybe the ministry, will investigate how widespread this issue is and why principal, in this case or maybe more, didn't go with their gut. Just surprising.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think we can talk around all of this, as each of you has pointed out. There are a whole lot more questions here, and I think that what's incumbent upon the next step in the process, John, is to make sure, to Kathleen's point, the right questions are asked, but they're answered in a way that we can all feel like, okay, we understand this has been addressed, and there has been some accountability. And if it gets at culture, and I go back to St. Mike's, that's what the question was all about, the culture at St. Mike's. And I'm just a longtime alumni at the school, and I'm a fan and all those things. But I lost connection with guys that I've known for years because I spoke out against it. People somehow thought I was trying to boost ratings on my radio show by coming, taking on the guys, and one of the guys involved in that, the president at the time, was a classmate of mine. So this is where I looked at it and said the culture is the issue. So I think, John, at that point, this is the lesson learned is going to have to be, what are the right questions being asked? Who is asking those questions, and how do we kind of put that into not necessarily an action plan even? I think it's just a matter of how do we address the culture to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen again.
Well, I think if you took a transcript of all four of us, and you as the moderator at the moment, you'd have a pretty good list of a lot of the questions we've asked. I mean, we've raised a lot of things. The only thing we haven't raised is the fact that, we have a lot of challenged kids in school, some with mental health issues, and there is, evidence, a lot of evidence that things happen that can involve them, and maybe that was part of the case, and pulling the trigger, bringing in the police, no pun intended, would have been a deep concern. But I want to go with your point, and that is that we have either Hockey Canada, or we have this situation, or many others, and that is a culture of trying to deal with things on their own, settle it away from the police. There seems to be, even in the corporate governance, a view that when something is happening internally, that they should handle it, and at the very last stage bring in the police or the outside group that's going to investigate something. So I think it's not just the culture of the school. It may be, in fact, in the governance models and the mindset of those who are actually governing. If I were a trustee, this would be something that I would want to stand up and say, look, let's not only review these protocols, and maybe it's done all the time, but let's assure the public, in light of this and other things, that it is dealt with. So I think it's a reminder that there are people at different levels who are dealing with these issues, and I think they're very mindful of the reverberation. That's not to take away from the victim. I mean, being a parent and having a young person with broken bones, to Keith's points, is incredibly difficult to handle, and especially over the time frame that they did. But I think there's a culture in terms of just trying to handle things on your own as opposed to bring in officials.
Yeah,
but perhaps this is why then the Ford government jumped in with, they put in one of their omnibus bills, might have been the budget bill this spring, and one of the others, they're packing stuff into the bills. They're bringing back school resource officers and mandating it, that schools must have police officers in the schools if that police force offers that service. Would this have helped this situation? Had there been after there had been a police officer in the school, would the assault have stopped before bones have broken? Who knows? He might have been at the wrong end of the school these things, it's not a guaranteed thing, but I think this is an effort by the government to deal with the growing violence we're seeing in schools. Teachers are reporting, heck, we're getting growing violence in hospitals, let alone in schools, but we're absolutely dealing with it in schools. And this is an effort, I think, to try and deal with it. It, of course, there's certain communities really are objecting to having police in the schools, but I think we're at a point where it might be absolutely necessary, and I think the government has come to the conclusion we are at that point.
Well, thanks. You just added a whole bunch more questions to the issue.
Well, but Keith, what you said about the police officer might have been at the other end of the school. You know, in the 90s, when I was actually in schools for a decade, I was doing conflict resolution work in schools. And at the same time, a woman named Deb Pepler was doing anti-bullying work. And she did some research on schoolyard. And 94% of bullying incidents were things that the teachers on the playground, teachers had no idea were happening. So that speaks to me to the necessity of dealing with the culture of the school. Like what is going on? Anyway, that issue of who's in the right place at the right time is a big part of why the culture has to be addressed.
Well, we'll wait to see what happens, because my guess is that Anwar's efforts, as well intended as they are, to some degree is going to kick up a whole lot of interest, conversation, and there will be next steps in this. So I'll be curious to see how their petition works out, and what the comments are from others across the province, because it is now a province-wide thing, and whether or not, in fact, the education minister has any comment or it gets involved in this. This week, kind of an interesting week, celebrating two I guess anniversaries. First, earlier in the week, it was the 30th anniversary of the Common Sense Revolution, the election of the first Mike Harris government, and then I guess next week it'll be 40 years for the Peterson government. So, and I thought it was interesting, Tim. I heard Premier Harris on with Deb Hutton earlier this week on the radio, and I don't know that I heard anything new from him, except that he made it really clear that if he were giving Doug Ford advice, it would make sure that he was balancing budgets. I don't think he would be a fan of some of the spending that the current Conservatives are doing. But I talked to Bob Reid about this, and he was the Harris's communications director at the time, and he said it was remarkable. We went from on like this flatline third place position to this large majority because Harris came out a year ahead with this Common Sense Revolution plan and said, "This is what I'm going to do if you want to move forward. If you elect me, this is what you're going to get." And whether you agreed with it or not, our consensus was on Now and Next that kind of changed political dynamics in Ontario, just in terms of saying, "Okay, I'm telling you right up front exactly what I'm going to do." He pounded away on the message, and people voted on it.
Yeah, it was quite revolutionary in that respect alone, let alone the policies that were part of the Common Sense Revolution. It was a lot of fun to be there. We had a 30th anniversary party at the Albany Club, and they recreated the sense of change, because it was scandalous to some longtime Albany Club members that Harris and the gang showed up in jeans and T-shirts for the celebration. So we all did that again. And I think we too rarely celebrate political achievement. I think Americans are far better at honoring their former leaders, and I think it's great to see Harris's win for 30 years ago, Peterson's 40. The sense of pride and ownership, whether you're one of the key campaign members, whether you're an MPP who was elected, whether you were a speechwriter or an envelope stuffer, the fact people felt so connected to that moment, what the good governance stood for, was just invigorating to be part of. Last comment on this, and I thought, Harris did a great job on Deb's show. He's still got game. I thought Harris was going to win. I felt that. I mean, I was 27 years. I wasn't too far to get a master's degree, but I thought I would lose. So my whole game plan back there was to carry the flag in a loser riding that hadn't voted PC since before I was born, and then get a job as a political staffer, be an advisor to a minister, maybe one day the premier. And then the sweep was so powerful, the gamble paid off in such a big way that I think I came in at number 79 out of 82. By the way, in the pool, Debbie bet against me.
Relationship forged in fire. Nicely done. Kathleen, I know we'll come back, and I'm sure Deb's message board at the time when the premier was on with her lit up with all kinds of complaints, and what about Ipperwash, and what about Walkerton, and all of those are legitimate questions. And there is no government that kind of goes through that length of time where there's going to always be some kind of scab. But at the same time, what we hear from certainly Premiers Harris and Peterson is a level of statesmanship that I think we've kind of also lost.
Oh, yes. It's looking for the nonpartisan fair. Let me just say this. It was a remarkable political achievement. I think that what Mike Harris did was galvanize a whole segment of the population that had kind of lost energy, lost political faith, and he brought them along. And the Common Sense Revolution document was brilliant. I'm not going to argue against that. Did I agree with it? No, I didn't. And I think there were lots of things that were unsaid in the document that then got implemented. But, kudos to him. Kudos to him for the way he managed his caucus, and there were some really, really strong, good people, Tim being one of them, who were part of that government. And I got to give them credit in terms of the statesmanship. Yeah, I think we've moved into a different era. When we talk about populism, that these guys were. I would say Harris might have been moving in that direction, but not the way we're seeing now. And they had a plan. They knew what they stood for. They articulated that, both of them, and then executed on it. So I think we have to give them credit for that.
Well, the other names that come up, Keith, and I probably wouldn't have otherwise heard of or heard from if it hadn't been for Mike Harris, are John Clark and Leah Castleman.
Absolutely. He made a career out of having strong opponents. And what was his pledge? There will not be one blade of grass untrampled on Queen's Park by protesters. And he was pretty much right. There wasn't. But last time I saw Mike Harris, I forget what event it was at, but we were just chatting just briefly, and he said, well, what are they blaming me for today? Because and this was just a few years ago, because he has never stopped being the villain in Canadian or Ontario politics since his administration. And it's not just the scandals. I think, the 22% cut to welfare rates in the post-NDP government era was pretty shocking to a lot of people. But his legacy, I think, is that of one who did what he said he was going to do. That brochure, that Common Sense Revolution brochure, was full of common sense ideas, and people were really, really fed up with the government of NDP at that time, Bob Rae's NDP government. Ironically, when we talk about David Peterson's legacy, they didn't actually win the 85 election, but they managed to defeat, with the NDP's help, defeat the Tories in the House. And a few weeks afterwards, 87, they won their majority. And in 1990, they blew it and led to the NDP government by going a year early, and people saw that as opportunistic. So I don't know if that's a great legacy either. He's certainly much more of a statesman, I think, than Mike Harris ever was. But Harris is, I think he's more in the populist vein, quite frankly. And I although he is a conservative fiscally, much more so than Doug Ford is, I think he's also in someone who could read the room and knew instinctively what voters wanted to do. And that's why he was able to get reelected, despite the huge changes he implemented in 1995. He got another majority in 1999 because, I think, in large part, because he did what he said he was going to do, and people really respected that. I think to some degree, a lot of, especially conservatives, still do.
Well, to that point about reading the room, John, in the conversation that Harris had with Deb, and she asked him, did you at any point you're sorry you left early, and he didn't miss a beat and said, no, absolutely not. I left at the right time, and he was reading the room clearly. But it was also the sense that I've done what I came to do, and I wasn't going to outstay my welcome. And we just spent the last 6 months kind of seeing how all of that had to be turned over federally, where a prime minister overstayed his welcome. And then, we had a government that was paralyzed up until a couple of weeks ago. So to that end, he was there to deliver on the Common Sense Revolution. It was done, and then he moved on.
Yeah, and I did polling for both of the, for the media, for both the Liberal Peterson campaign, where the NDP won, and for the Harris double victories. And Dave, I think a lot of it just comes from having a campaign team that's able to capture that mood in the room, put the right slogan to it. But it was also a case in those times where politicians were being held to account to do what they said they would do. That was really what this was about. Yes, it was about common sense decision making around government decisions. Yes, it was about capturing the mood in the room when people had experienced the NDP and the decisions that they were making. But I have to give a lot of credit to the campaign team. They were able to sustain a framework during the campaign of that slogan. And then when they were first year in government, they were able to put it around all of the various decisions that were made and keep it rolling after that. So again, I think this really had a lot to do with the campaign teams around both of them, and to take advantage of what had just come previously where they were able to build on that.
Dave, I know Tim wants to tell a positive story. I just want to
that first.
Well, I just think anybody who's listening to this has got to know that I believe that there was serious and permanent damage done by the Harris government. I think that there were things that were broken that may have been implicit in the platform of the Common Sense Revolution, but not consulting with cities, amalgamating school boards, the changes to school boards, just the conversation we had a few minutes ago about principals, taking principals out of the federation and making that separation between the educators and the administrators. Like, there's a whole long list of structural things that were changed. The statement that Mike Harris made that, he wanted to make it impossible for, or difficult for, I can't remember, but paraphrasing, for any future premier to raise taxes. So, he did that. Yeah. Is that a good thing? Is that something that you want to be proud of? Is breaking things something you want to be proud of? I would argue not, but I just need to be on the record that is, I think that's a tenable view. And I think the deification of any of our past leaders, I think respect for them and finding the positives, I think that's a good thing. But the deification and the kind of washing over the negatives, not such a great thing.
Tim?
There goes the rest of the show.
Sorry.
Look, my rebuttal to rebuttal, but all of those, every one of Premier Wynne's lists there, none of them undone by subsequent governments of two different stripes. Look, I think the standout lesson for Premier Harris takeaway is that voters do reward courage. If you say what you're going to do, even if it's difficult, and you do what you said you're going to do, they reward you with another government. Just one quick story, Dave. So it was a great celebration. And you may remember this. You folks will probably remember this. Harris had a routine about the accomplishments. It sort of went like this: photo radar, gone; job killing Bill 40, gone; unfair job quotas, gone, right? Keeps going down that list. 65 Liberal NDP tax hikes, gone. And he says, gold-plated MPP pension, got. And he turns, looks at Doug Ford, he says, okay, maybe not that one.
Well, for telling little stories, I'll tell you my political astuteness, and this shows how plugged in I am. In 1989, Janet Ecker, who was then working for the third-party leader Mike Harris, took me to lunch and offered me a job working communications for Mike Harris. And I said, "Come on, Janet, if he was going anywhere, you'd take the job." Of course, Janet did not bring that up when I went back in 1999, and she was a cabinet minister. She came out for scrum. She very graciously did not bring that up.
Well, that's awesome.
Big doings at Queen's Park this week. We have finally taken the cladding down around John A. And I realize that, John, they have treated the statue with some kind of whatever treatment so that even if people spray it, it's going to be easy to clean up. I think there's probably an over and under on how quickly that's going to happen. But we had this conversation a couple of weeks ago on Now and Next, and it's my view, and we've, not to get back into the whole burying history, but this is a really important issue in as much as if we're going to have a real conversation about truth and reconciliation, given it's June, that we need to be talking about John A. And to Kathleen Wynne's point, if there are negatives in there, we can't gloss over them. And if there are things that he did that are positive, we need to celebrate them and acknowledge them. So, I don't know that there'll ever be a statue to Mike Harris on the front lawn of Queen's Park, but it kind of picks up on that conversation where if we're going to have that, we can't have truth and reconciliation if we ignore some of the warts in John A.'s past.
Well, absolutely. And I think, it was evident that the Indigenous community reacted with, in some cases, anger and deep concern about the statue being unveiled again. But I think it was more about not having the recognition of the history of what had gone before with Macdonald. It's a very personal view, but I think the statue should stay. But I also think that there should be plaques on either side of that, English and in French or Indigenous, whatever you want to have, that explains some of this with a barcode that you could, take and find out more about things. I think it's important to teach people about it as opposed to simply remove things. And unless it's absolutely offensive to everybody, pretty much. But I think there's a learning opportunity here, and I think that needs to be balanced when the statue is unveiled.
Well, I mean, given the era we're in, Kathleen, there's no reason why there shouldn't be a sort of a digital display, a QR code that allows me to kind of walk through these things as I'm seeing it on my phone. I can hear what's going on. I mean, that's history. I mean, I to John's point, I think there's a real opportunity here.
Absolutely. It's very interesting as when we think about who's represented in our history. And this goes back to when I was studying history at Queen's. I remember sitting in classes and wondering when the social history, when the part about the women and the non-white straight men, when we were going to have that conversation, and so I think we've done a really terrible job over the decades of telling the story of who we are as a country, as a world, and so we got to do better. But that doesn't mean erasing people who did big significant things. It's just that there were lots of people who did big significant things in quieter ways. Maybe they weren't in elected office, and maybe they weren't white guys. And if they were white guys, then as John says, let's tell the whole story about that white guy. Let's talk about what he did in total, not just that he was a leader and he was, a founder of the country. That's part of the story. That's not the whole story.
In the recognizing that a bunch of you got things to do and we want to cut you loose presently, I don't want to leave without talking about the anticipation of G7, and we can take this where we want. But again, as I noted off the top, one of the things that we talked about last week, Tim, was the idea that first there was the one economy legislation that the Carney folks tabled last week. And then the other part of this is getting ready for G7, all the buzz around, is there a deal? Is there not a deal? CBC yesterday was reporting that there is the framework for a deal. And the more I listen to how this is happening, the dynamics of who's being invited, I begin to wonder whether or not we're going to see more than one deal announced, more than one framework, whether it's individually with the United States, or if we're going to see Canada and Mexico. Mexico's been invited and accepted the invitation. There's going to be something there that's going to happen. I think this is probably the most significant G7 meeting I've seen in years, because wow, there's a whole lot of there's a possibility here that something might happen, that the final statement hasn't already been written before they actually get into the meetings.
Yeah, I hope so. Well, I'm just going to, revert to the rules of question period, Dave, and I'm going to answer the question that I want to answer, not what you asked. I can do that. I'm just going to say on the John A, because he is what he is, yeah, but he's one of the great old white guys. I am a John A. Macdonald fan, and I sometimes history speaks in poetry. And at a time we're talking about Canadian nationalism, we're talking about tearing down barriers between provinces, of major projects to unite our country from coast to coast, celebrating our history and the king being on the throne speech. That's all John A. Macdonald to a T, right? That sort of defines his style of leadership. So I like the fact that history has released him from his wooden bondage at this particular time of what's going on. So on that, yeah, I hope so, right? I mean, all the chatter seems to be that we're moving closer to a deal. I think that Prime Minister Carney has, played this very well. In fact, probably a model to be emulated by other leaders across the world. His approach to President Trump, I suspect, will put things on the table. Trump will want a deal. He'll want to claim victory. But man, the boost this will be for stability, investment, if we can get inside that tariff wall, will be extraordinary for Canadians. We can move forward. And you're absolutely right, Dave. If it's possible, I'm sure that would be a goal. It's a pretty cool stage to announce it on at the G7.
Yeah, Keith, the idea that all of the leaders, and I realize there's a whole lot of heat around inviting Modi, and I get that, and I'm not quite sure. But again, if this is a tell, then maybe there's something else going on here that isn't just about being kind to India. That in fact there must be something else that's happening that is preparing Carney to take the slings and arrows on all the criticism of inviting him.
Well, expectations have been raised for this G7 in ways that we haven't seen in previous ones. Usually they're lowered a little bit. We're seeing them raised. I think inviting India, I mean, what do? Do you want to isolate India? Do you want to isolate a huge democracy like India? I know we have some issues with India. I mean, the RCMP raised the issue of them killing someone on Canadian soil. That's problematic. But I think trying to change India will take direct engagement with India, and we do want trading relationships with them. So I think it's absolutely important. I think overall the G7, as I say, this one's going to be very crucial because I think the expectations are clearly there that Canada and the United States will have a deal that somehow lessens these tariffs. I don't think the tariffs are going to be eliminated, but at least gets them down to the 10% range or something that's manageable for companies, and that people can see some certainty going forward. We'll see some business investment coming back. And if I could as well, just for a minute, on the Sir John A. stuff. I mean, first of all, he's being judged by 21st century standards, which is difficult. We do have to do a better job on history and education. But the Americans have really come to grips with the fact that their founding fathers were pretty much all slave owners. Why can't we come to grips with the fact that our founding fathers were not perfect?
Yeah, I agree with that, but that has to be in the telling and a good balance to telling of that story. Kathleen, how much do you think that whatever happens at G7, and if in fact we get anything that resembles frameworks for deals, something that kind of gives us some direction vis-a-vis trade or security, because it sounds like this is more than just trade, that this will be actually important in the conversation among the first ministers and the prime minister in terms of, okay, now we see what the landscape looks like internationally, particularly with the United States. Okay, now against that backdrop, here's how we're going to move forward and hit the reset button in Canada.
Well, I hope that's what we have. All of you have heard Scott Reed talk about being in his room full of worries. I feel I feel a little bit like I'm in that room full of worries because the expectations are so high. I agree with Tim that I think Mark Carney has handled this whole process brilliantly, but who knows? And Dave, I don't know about any kind of sense of security going forward. But I think the only way we get there is what you're saying, which is to have a plan. This is how we're going to behave. This is how these countries working together are going to behave. And there's a bit of an isolation of Donald Trump, if that's even possible. But in order to protect ourselves in terms of that insecurity. But man, it's a volatile situation. So I think it's a stay tuned. I think that Carney's doing everything he can to set it up so that it is a rational and productive process, but I just don't think we know.
John?
Well, I think in previous circumstances, it was a G7 meeting where things were discussed and a statement was put together at the end where all of them contributed. That's not going to happen this time. It's only going to be one statement that's going to be put out by Mark Carney. Secondly, the platform is really about Donald Trump. There's nothing else there. I mean, there are all the issues on the table, but it is to focus on Donald Trump. And I really believe that, again, the host has the ability to invite people to the table that they want to. And in this case, you don't invite people to the table unless Donald Trump will accept them being at the table. So I'm on the side that says that this is a platform for Donald Trump to take credit for putting together a whole series of deals. It's symbolic. I'm sure. I mean, he's got one with Britain already, but for the other ones, it gives him a chance to, on a global stage, say, see, I can do it. And I really do believe that coming out of this is going to be something for everybody. But I think this has been stage managed probably since Mark Carney left the room with Donald Trump and went into that side room, and there were some conversations, and everything has been worked on to meet that agenda. So I suspect something will be delivered, and it will be more than just Canada.
Well, reinforcing Prime Minister Carney's image as Santa Claus. I clearly.
Well, yeah, but he's also said if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
You're on the menu. Yeah. Exactly.
So I mean, there you are. He's invited a whole lot more to eat, though.
It's Carney as mediator too. It's not just
Right.
Santa Claus, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very good. All right. Well, we'll wait to see what happens, and we'll sift through the entrails next time we meet. So, Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, Keith Leslie, John Wright, thank you all for being here. And for those of you who are following along closely, we did have some technical bumps, but we got through them. So, again, thanks for joining us. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. If you're listening on the podcast platforms and you haven't hit the follow button yet, do that. If you're watching on YouTube, hit subscribe. You get this show and Now and Next. And if you're listening on the radio on Saturday mornings on News Talk 1010 in Toronto, you're only getting part of the show. I mean, you're getting a good part of the show, but there's part of the show you're not hearing because it's an edited version. So I'm just saying, you can listen on demand on either YouTube or the podcast platforms, iHeart, Spotify, Apple, you know where they are. But it'd be great to have you join us. And if you've got comments or thoughts on the show, feel free to leave them. Otherwise, enjoy your weekend, making the mid-turn into June. Holy cow. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford. Thanks for being here.
I have a YouTube channel right here, as you can all people see. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content. Look at this. Bye now.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.